In this presentation, I'll be speaking about anti-Semitic text detection. I'm particularly interested in this area because as a Jew, I am experiencing increased anti-Semitism, especially online, and it is a growing concern both in the United States and across the world. I also chose to focus specifically on anti-Semitic text detection as a microcosm of hate speech detection because it allows me to narrow my focus to a smaller area with a smaller set of problems. That said, I do believe that the lessons learned throughout this project, which will be conveyed throughout the presentation, are applicable to all areas of hate speech detection, as the similarities between anti-Semitism and anti-black racism, homophobia, far outweigh the differences between these areas of hateful thinking. First and foremost, we need to define the terms that we're dealing with. So first, the definition of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is defined as prejudice, hostility, or discrimination towards Jewish people on a religious, cultural, or ethnic grounds. Now we move into some trickier areas. Anti-Zionism is defined as opposition to Zionism. So what is Zionism? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, Zionism is originally a movement among Jewish people for the reestablishment of a Jewish nation in Palestine. Later, a movement for the development and protection of the State of Israel. Also, advocacy or support for this. Now, the tricky part with this is that many people would consider anti-Zionism a newer form of or a subform of anti-Semitism. There are a number of reasons for this. First and foremost, the terms and phrases used in anti-Zionism very often tend to reflect tropes and stereotypes that were once very common in anti-Semitism, such as people controlling a worldwide media campaign that controls people's minds and controls the world, huge donors that control politicians all around the world. These were all anti-Semitic tropes that are clearly false and damaging to the Jewish people, and now Jewish has been substituted with Zionist. The other reason is that Zionism is an inherently Jewish ideal. Zionism is a huge part of the vast majority of the Jewish world. Most Jews are Zionists. Most Jews do believe in the Jewish right to return to the homeland that they were exiled from almost 2,000 years ago. However, there are a number of people who disagree with this definition and believe that anti-Zionism is not a subcategory or new version of anti-Semitism. These people believe that anti-Zionism is all legitimate criticism of a nationalist political movement that is divorced from religion and solely focused on having an ethno-national state. With that in mind, it becomes very difficult to decide what counts as anti-Semitism when we're looking for words. Finally, before we move on to a deeper discussion of this, hate speech. The Oxford English Dictionary defines hate speech as speech or address inciting hatred or intolerance, especially towards a particular group on the basis of ethnicity, religious belief, sexuality, etc. Or B, speech or sometimes written material inciting such hatred or intolerance. So this is a very broad definition. It doesn't make it easy to narrow down what hate speech is. It's really anything that we could classify as hatred or intolerance. To sum up, all of these definitions are very subjective, and there's no one definition for any of these, and there's no one way of understanding these words, which means that interpretations of what qualifies as anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and hate speech can vary from one person to another, making it very difficult to decide what we want to limit and what we want to allow. Now, taking a closer focus on anti-Semitic speech, we might think that this is a very simple question, but it's not. There are a lot of nuances to this and a lot of challenging things. There are words that are very clearly anti-Semitic, and you would be hard-pressed to find someone who will disagree with you. Examples of these are the common slur kike, dirty Jew, or Christ killer, words that have been used throughout history to persecute Jews and to make them the other that you can hate. Even with these words, though, there can be problems. For example, the word kike is spelled the exact same way as a nickname, a common Spanish nickname, Kike. For example, there's a baseball player in the MLB named Kike Hernandez. So were we to flag Kike as a slur all the time, we would be incidentally flagging and potentially removing posts from people with the name Kike, which is a big problem. It makes it very hard to detect these things. Now, anti-Semitic speech gets much more complicated when we move past the slurs and obvious words into tropes. So we have things that are common throughout history, like big noses, media control, banking control, a world-controlling cabal that just pulls all the strings throughout the world, and a depiction of Jews as devils or devil worshippers. Throughout history, Jews have been depicted with horns. This is connected to the Christ killer, but goes a little bit deeper and is a little bit more symbolic. Tropes make it a lot harder to find anti-Semitic text because it's more disguised. And we'll get into that on the next slide. And now we can go a little bit deeper with the issue of Zionism. So we see a lot of terms applied to Jews living in Israel, like Zionazi or Nazi Jews, which flips the script of the Holocaust and makes the Jews the persecutors and the Palestinians the victims. This is not to say that criticism of the Israeli government and its policies is not legitimate, but according to many sources, including the American Jewish Committee, this Nazi Jew is inherently anti-Semitic and is actually a form of Holocaust denial by making the Jews into the bad guys and ignoring and equating other atrocities with the Holocaust. So most people would classify things like Zionazi or Nazi Jew as an anti-Semitic term. However, there are people who would not and would say that these are legitimate criticisms. Again, making this a very difficult problem to solve. What do we call anti-Semitic speech? I have my own definitions, partially informed by my experience as a Jew and my experience of anti-Semitism, but there are a number of other people who have different opinions, both Jewish and non-Jewish people. So this is a difficult issue. Now we can get into some more specifics. How do we want to detect anti-Semitism? What are we actually going to look for when we look at a document, at a comment, at a tweet, whatever it is that we're looking at? So detecting keywords it's easy and it's effective. There are a few caveats, like words with multiple meanings, such as kike, which could also be the name Kike, as discussed on the previous slide. But largely, detecting the word Zionazi or kike or the phrase big-nosed Jews is relatively simple, easy, and they're likely to be anti-Semitic tweets or comments, etc. However, there are more difficult things to look for, such as anti-Semitic tropes, stereotypes. So, what if it doesn't say big-nosed Jew, and instead it says the big noses? It could be speaking about Jews. It could also be some plastic surgeon discussing work that he does. There are also anti-Semitic dog whistles, a few examples of which are listed on this slide, that are hard to detect because they could mean something else. For example, 88. 88 is a white supremacist dog whistle. It stands for the 8th letter of the alphabet twice, which is HH, which is short for Hail Hitler. But it could also be someone's birth year. It could also be just a number that they're using in their profile or in a comment. So the context of these tweets really matters. Let's look at a couple of examples. Example 1, we see they control the media. But when we say they control the media, who are they? What's the context? My first impression when I see this is it's anti-Semitic. That's built out of my experiences. Usually when I hear they control the media, someone's talking about the Jewish-controlled media, which is a conspiracy that's existed for hundreds of years. But it could also just be talking about a different political group or a different ethnic group. We have no idea. It could also just be saying, Hollywood producers control the media. We don't know what they're talking about without more context. In example 2, we have they'll do anything as long as they can get some of that banking money. Again, this one reeks of anti-Semitism to me. It sounds like a common criticism of Jews, a common stereotype that we are always out for the money and that we control the banks. But what if they, in this quote, is talking about finance students at an Ivy League university, and it's criticizing them for having no ethics and saying that all they care about is money? Then it clearly wouldn't be an anti-Semitic post. So context is very important, and using just keywords to get context is not going to be useful to us because it's not always going to be there. It's especially a problem given that these hateful groups and hateful people know that people are looking for keywords. You're not particularly likely to see the word kike typed out on Twitter because they know that it's going to get flagged and they know that there's a strong chance that it'll get removed or hidden as hate speech. So instead they're going to use dog whistles or coded language. So we need people who are familiar with these dog whistles, these stereotypes, the history of anti-Semitism, and new and emerging forms of anti-Semitism in order to understand the context behind a given piece of text. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to show an example of a small project that I did to try to detect some anti-Semitic comments. In order to find the data, I scraped 1,000 comments using Reddit's API from reddit.com/r/Palestine. And I added 10 more traditionally anti-Semitic comments using some slurs and some very common tropes. I then filtered out comments that contain only links, and there are a lot of automated Reddit moderator replies to a post. I filtered those out as well. After doing that, I ended up with a total of 957 comments, of which I labeled 130 as anti-Semitic. Now, as a disclaimer, I am the one who labeled these comments. This is based on my experience and my understanding of anti-Semitism and my understanding of tropes. There were a number of comments that criticized the Israeli government and military and people that I did not label as anti-Semitic because they did not exhibit any of these common tropes. However, there are comments that I did label as anti-Semitic that I'm sure some people would disagree with and say, no, that's a legitimate criticism. No, that's that's anti-Zionist, not anti-Semitic. So again, I just want to emphasize the fact that this is very difficult because there's no agreed upon definition for any of these terms, and there's no agreed upon metric. So all of this hate speech detection is very subjective and very difficult to agree upon. First, I decided to try to do a simple keyword detection throughout the comments. So to do this, for each comment in the dataset, I tokenized and lemmatized the comment, and then used word2vec to vectorize the tokens so that I could calculate the cosine similarity between vectorized tokens and hate speech. The two words that I used were kike and Zionazi because I wanted to keep the scope very limited. It becomes a huge problem if you try to include too many words into your hate speech. While there might be a lot of comments that contextually are anti-Semitic because they contain the word Jew, they aren't actually. I mean, you could have a comment saying, Jews like to go to synagogue on Saturday. That's a true statement. It's not anti-Semitic at all, but if you're looking for the word Jew, it's going to get detected as anti-Semitism. So then I used 3 thresholds to check the accuracy of the algorithm. So I labeled based on whether or not the cosine similarity between vectorized tokens and the vectorized hate speech, so kike and Zionazi, were similar with a factor of 0.3, 0.6, and 0.9. So we see on the far left that when the threshold is 0.3, we detect a large portion of the true positives. Remember, there were 130 anti-Semitic terms, but we didn't get them all. Only a little bit more than 50% if you look at the false negative bar. And we had a lot of false positives and a lot of true negatives. So the vast majority were still found to be non-anti-Semitic, and we missed a lot of the anti-Semitic posts. This makes sense. We're just looking for incredibly anti-Semitic keywords and not looking for any tropes. We're not looking for any dog whistles, no stereotypes, no tone. None of that is involved in this. So that makes sense. When we increase the threshold to 0.6, the true positives and false positives drops to almost nothing. Very few anti-Semitic texts were detected. Almost all of them were labeled as non-anti-Semitic. That's because, as I said before, these terms are not often used. Zionazi, kike, I believe in the entire data set, kike is used once, and then it's abbreviated a couple of times. Zionazi is often has asterisks blocking it out, so if the similarity is too high, then it won't detect this as being the same word. And when we increase to 0.9, the results are the same. Almost nothing is actually identified as anti-Semitic, and our method is relatively useless because we're not actually finding any anti-Semitic tweets. So let's move on to the next section. In this part, I used GPT from OpenAI. I input all of the comments. I did not lemmatize them. I did not tokenize them. I just fed the text directly into the model. And I told the GPT that it's a model that detects anti-Semitic text. It's supposed to return a 1 for anti-Semitism, a 0 for not anti-Semitism, and if it cannot answer, it's supposed to reply with the number 2. So we see that there were a number where there was no answer, but I looked at all of those, and they all were labeled as non-anti-Semitic by me. So it didn't avoid anti-Semitic text solely for the purpose of appearing to not approach conflict, which I was concerned about because ChatGPT is often trained to be non-combative and to avoid hate speech. So now looking at the positives, all but one anti-Semitic comment was detected as anti-Semitic. So we see that the model performed very well at detecting text that is truly anti-Semitic. However, there's a big problem. Look at the false positive bar. There were a huge number of false positives, which means that this model was detecting large swaths of text that were not anti-Semitic as anti-Semitic. This means that if we were using this model to remove comments or to flag people for being anti-Semitic, we'd be labeling a huge number of people as anti-Semitic when they really aren't. I think this is especially egregious considering the fact that I took a relatively wide view of anti-Semitic, and I classified things that were anti-Zionist and utilized an anti-Semitic trope as anti-Semitic, while other people may not classify that as anti-Semitic. So the GPT model actually performed pretty poorly when we think about it. While it was able to detect a lot of anti-Semitism, it over-detected at such a rate that it's not usable. Comparing results, we see that Simple keyword detection is incredibly dependent on sensitivity for how similar a given word in our comment has to be to a anti-Semitic word for us to label the comment as anti-Semitic. This is a problem because people are often likely to put asterisks in words to avoid being detected, or to spell things slightly differently to avoid being detected, so it makes it really hard for us to find things. But if we go too broad, then the word Zionist is going to be equated with Zionazi by our model, and these have very different meanings. Zionist is not a slur, Zionazi is. We also have a problem with which keywords to try to detect. Do we actually try to detect kike, or does that become a problem because we're going to flag Hispanic people with the name Kike? And should we flag phrases like big nose Jew, or should we avoid going too nitty gritty and having too many terms and try to stay a little bit broader? It's a difficult question, and it's really up to each person what they think we should do here. The GPT model is not very good at all, and it hugely over-detects anti-Semitism to a point that it's not even useful for finding anti-Semitism. So perhaps the best solution is to use a specifically trained neural network. Maybe if we train a perceptron model or a deep learning network to detect anti-Semitism based on the entirety of a comment, taking into context the context of the comment and each word to detect anti-Semitism, maybe we would be able to better find it. While GPT models have a very strong understanding of the English language and are very good at using it, clearly they're not great at this, and maybe it's because it's not specifically trained for this purpose. But does this actually solve our problem? And the answer is that it doesn't. Even though a deep learning network or a perceptron model might perform better at correctly identifying labeled anti-Semitic text versus non-anti-Semitic text, this doesn't begin to solve our problem of detecting anti-Semitism, because someone still has to build the model. Someone's definition of anti-Semitism is used. These are all human-built models. It doesn't matter whether or not the model performs better and is more accurate if we don't know which definition we're supposed to use for anti-Semitism, if we don't know which person we're supposed to trust. Two people could build models that are identical and incredibly accurate except for their definition, except for their labels. And because they label different things as anti-Semitic or not anti-Semitic, they'll achieve wildly different results. And there's no agreement on what hate speech is. So while a neural network might perform very well, and I would imagine it would perform much better than our other two options, it doesn't help us with the issue of hate speech, because the issue of hate speech is more of a human issue than a computer issue. Very much related to these definitions of anti-Semitism are some of the key issues with our ethical implications. First, free speech. Should we censor these comments? Should we really be detecting anti-Semitism, removing it from platforms? Or should we be honoring free speech, and should we be allowing people to say whatever they want, regardless of how offensive it might be to someone and how hateful it is? That's a very complicated ethical question. I don't think anyone's been able to effectively answer it. And it leads to a further problem. If we do censor people, does it make the problem worse? If there's a group of people posting anti-Semitic content on the internet and we censor their comments, we remove them, does the benefit of removing those comments from the internet, preventing more people from reading them, actually outweigh the propaganda value it gives these anti-Semites? When you remove their stuff, when you take it off the internet, it just kind of confirms their narrative, especially with anti-Semitic hate speech. It confirms the narrative that Jews control everything. If anti-Semitic text is removed from the internet, then the anti-Semite looks at it and says, look, I was right. They did remove my stuff. They do control the internet. They control the media. That's why there's no anti-Semitism out there. So it becomes a big issue, whether or not we should remove it or whether or not it makes the anti-Semitic situation worse. There's also the issue of privacy. Is it okay to be training on these people's comments and looking at it? One argument might be that yes, it is perfectly fine. They're posting it publicly on the internet. It's available to everyone. But it also could be damaging to their reputation. People do change and the internet is forever. It's something that needs to be discussed a little bit more. And finally, going back to what we've been discussing this whole time, what is legitimate criticism and what is hate speech? This is especially relevant when it comes to anti-Semitism because no one agrees on what is a legitimate criticism of Israel and what is anti-Semitism. It's something that's been debated for decades and will likely continue to be debated for the duration of the existence of Israel and the Jewish people. And the chances of people coming to an agreement are very low. When you take all these ethical problems together, I would argue that it's not worth building a hate speech detector, at least regarding anti-Semitism. The issues in building one are far too complicated. It's incredibly difficult to find a definition that you want to work with. It's incredibly difficult to have a labeled data set to train a neural network that people can actually agree upon. And then the effects of actually censoring free speech and of detecting hateful comments can make the situation significantly worse for the Jewish people and for all other groups who are victims of hate speech. This does not only apply to the Jewish people. This can be expanded to any group where sometimes censoring the hate speech makes the people even more hateful. Thank you for listening to my presentation. On this following slide, I have my citations for definitions that I use and for discussion of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. The rest of this presentation is my original work. Thank you very much for watching.